Thanks. All right. Yes, I'm Mart van Kuijk, and I joined Wereldhave since 2023 as the ESG manager. Of course, Wereldhave already has a long track record of ESG and sustainability, and our predecessors worked on it in the years before. And I think Wereldhave is quite mature in that, in the ESG performance. But I will tap into that later on. I'm an environmental scientist. I have a bachelor in it, did a business administration in Utrecht, and I worked on the institutional investor side with the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development, which you might know as an investor. I report directly to the CFO, to Dennis, and I will work together within the ESG team, which is also with a sustainability manager from Belgium, which will be new in December. So what's coming our way? And I will try to explain all the abbreviations because there's a lot in the ESG sphere. But if you don't know any of them, I will try to explain them. So what are the general developments and trends? First of all, there's a lot of benchmarks and regulations that we need to comply with. But as a small listed equity, we need to prioritize and we need to analyze what's most material for us. So we're trying to do that and try to see what's most best fit for our strategy, and also listen to our investors to see what they find important. Then there's a lot of legislation coming our way as well. Of course, we have the EU taxonomy, which on paper is 600 pages, and the CSRD, which is also a big book. But we started with analyzing that in 2022, and we did a gap analysis, and we're well on the way on finding the data, adapting our reporting, and also pushing forward to 2025 and being compliant with the legislation that we need to comply with. Then what we see in benchmarks, but also questions from investors, that there's a big and large focus on Scope 3 emissions. Of course, you also see it with the lawsuit of Shell, where there's a big focus on their Scope 3, and they are not taking care of in their strategy. I will also tap onto Scope 3 emissions further in my presentation. But for now, it's 80% of our total emissions, so it's a big part. And then green finance, what we see is that a lot of investors want a green part in financing. As Wereldhave, we have a green financing framework, and currently we have one sustainability-linked loan and one more in negotiation. And this will be increased. We need to report on several sustainability-linked indicators, and we get a subsidy if we manage to reach those indicators. Then for real estate, some developments and trends. I think a big part of our sustainability strategy is our solar panels, and we already have a big area of solar panels on our roofs. But especially in the Netherlands, we have a problem with net congestion. So we need to find new ways and possibilities and solutions to increase our solar panel area while still balancing the net. This is also in my further presentation. Then we need to build circular. Next to the EU climate change legislation, there's also circular legislation, and we need to reduce our resources until 2030. So that's a big focus that we also need to comply with. Then climate risk and opportunities. We already see the temperature, of course, rising, and our centers are mostly located in urban areas, which has an urban heat island. And this is a risk on itself. But what we also see is that within heat waves, people gather to our centers and find a cooling place. So it's also an opportunity, and we need to balance that. And then EPC labels, one of the most important things for the EU taxonomy. It's the main parameter. Currently 37% of our portfolio is EPC label A, and within our Paris-proof roadmaps, our climate strategy, we're working on increasing that and making more sustainable assets.
Is data on actual energy usage also part of this?
Of which one?
Besides the energy labels, also the actual energy usage of the tenants?
So when an EPC label is founded, they look at the actual energy consumption of the building at that moment. Yeah. So our Better Tomorrow strategy was founded in 2020 and has a timeline until 2030 with specific goals for 2025. I think it covers our most material sustainability topics. And we have 3 pillars: better footprint, better nature, and better living. I will touch upon better footprint in the next slides, but to give a short introduction on better nature, we have climate risk assessments for all our centers ready. So we look at the risk of floods, for example, but also urban heat islands and what the effects are for different climate scenarios. And for habitats and biodiversity, it's important to also increase ecological value at our centers. So this year we increased the ecological value for 7 centers, and really looking with an ecologist on how to improve that. For better living, of course, zero accidents and MPU engagements are important, but I think a big project for us as well is our community, and we want to be central in the cities that we are active in, and we try to spend, or we have a goal to spend 1% of our NRI, our net rental income, on social impact initiatives. For example, on job markets, projects for the more vulnerable in the communities that we are active in. But these initiatives are also outlined in our annual report. So better footprint, our impact on climate change. I think this is one of our most material topics, and climate change is, you mostly see it on paper, so I want to do a little experiment with 1 ton of CO2. So this roof is approximately 10 meters high, and it's also 10 meter wide. If you would take 1 ton of CO2, it's a sphere of 10 by 10 in diameter. And I think it's good to imagine that, because you always see tons of CO2 on paper, but it's good to imagine that what you're actually emitting is coming into the atmosphere, and that is such a big size. So it's also an incentive for our employees to keep on reducing our climate change impact. So since 2020, we are really actively looking at our Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 are our own operational emissions, and Scope 3 is, for example, tenant emissions, but also the products that we acquire and purchase, and some other smaller categories. But we have full sight on our emissions and trying to improve, of course, but I will leave it with that. So how are we doing? Compared to 2018, if you look back, we managed to reduce 27% on CO2 emissions, which I think is a big accomplishment. Of course, we're helped a bit by the energy crisis. Energy prices went up, so also to reduce cost, we lowered temperatures while remaining comfort levels. But together with operational excellence, providing more insulation, including PV, we managed to reach that 27%. And I did some calculations on 23, and we're really looking at a nice trend down. So you'll be able to see that in the next annual report, but it's looking quite good. So for 2030, the minus 30% CO2 emissions, we'll probably be able to get that. Wereldhave has committed itself to 2 different climate targets. One is the science-based target, which is based on absolute CO2 emissions, which is the 30%. And the other one is the Paris Proof commitment, and that's a trajectory. And for all our assets, we look if the asset is within the trajectory of the Paris Proof commitment. What we did is we asked Roy Haskoning DFV to make Paris Proof roadmaps for all our assets. And this is a simplified model, the graph, of how we look at it. So for each asset, we know the different measures that are needed to make the asset Paris Proof. And we use that information, for example, in the business plans, but also in transformation assessment and CapEx assessments to see what is needed to get the absolute CO2 emission reduction and also to make it Paris-proof in the long run.
How do you integrate your retailers into the Paris-proof roadmap? Their energy usage, the green leases. How does that fit into the roadmap?
The green leases?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Paris-proof commitment, it's focused on the whole building. So it's both our own emissions, but also our tenant emissions. So the assessment of Royal Haskoning DFA, it also includes the units of the tenants. So we also know what the tenants need to decrease. Yeah.
One question, sorry, on so installed heat pumps, right? So then you replace fossil with, but there's also like an extra additional need for electricity generation. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's also what's becoming more difficult due to balancing the net. But as you can see within our Paris-proof roadmap, you see PV in all the stages. So I think it's called Trias Energetica. You first need to insulate the building, and then you add new energy systems. And the new energy systems are in many cases electrified, but you need to look at the energy that you get from renewable sources and balance that. So it's different for each center. But first you need to get the shell insulated.
So how much of the total electricity you need? So that's like the current plus the additional, are you able to generate from solar? And how much you have to get from elsewhere, such as like buying green electricity?
Yeah, so it's on the next slide. I can go to that. But 11% of our total energy consumption at this moment is solar. Yeah. But that's for our own consumption, and not with tenant consumption included. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
So you have like a tenant consumption. Do you think you're able to generate via own solar on the buildings, that you're able to supply tenants with the electricity they need, or?
It differs per center because we have a roof, for example, and sometimes it's big enough, sometimes it's not big enough. Sometimes we have, for example, a parking, and then we need to have a solar pergola, so PV panels on a insulation above the parking. But we know for each of the centers what is needed to include it. But yeah, we still need a lot of PV to be installed to electrify it. But that's of course the case for the whole of Netherlands. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if to get to the ESG capex. We looked at what we included in the transformation, specifically on ESG capex, which is 14.3 million. And we find it yielding because it's partly PV panels, but it's also adding value to the asset. For example, increasing the energy label and therefore being of higher value. And we also looked at the plans that are currently in place for transformations. And we now have 4.7 for the next 2 years on ESG capex. This does not include for example, ESG capex or ESG measures that we include in general maintenance. So for example, when a roof is end of life, we include insulation. And that insulation is top-notch and Paris-proof aligned, for example, but we still need to filter out that data for further purposes. So that's not included. Then 2 ESG projects that we have started up in 2023, and there are dedicated teams working on it within our company. One is the solar strategy. So what we see is that subsidies going down, so it's more difficult to get the business case ready for PV. So we're looking for partnerships with, for example, supermarkets, because if you look at the profile of energy for supermarkets and PV panels, it's quite balanced. So we can try to sell the roof with solar panels and rent it out to supermarkets, which is possible within the FBI regime. So it's 11% of total energy consumption. And I think a second one, which will become increasingly important, which is also asked from different benchmarks and investors, is EV charging. We now have EV charging at all our Belgium centers and most of the Dutch centers. And it's from different suppliers. So what we're now trying to do is try to get one supplier, which makes it more convenient for the users, but also to being able to spread it out on the whole portfolio. and also trying to get a business case, for example, a certain percentage of kilowatt hour per user, and then making a business case out of it. But with EV charging, and it's difficult in some cases to get insurance right, because within parking garages there's a fire hazard, for example, so you need to have different measures in place. But we're looking on it on a portfolio level, because electric vehicles, at least in the Netherlands, will increase exponentially. That's the end. I don't know if there's any other questions.
So one question, what do you see as the biggest challenge for Wereldhave regarding, if you look at ESG?
Good question. I think that's based on scope 3 emissions. It's probably our downstream leased assets, which is actually our tenant emissions. We're working on getting more insight in it, but also our leasing team and asset management team working together with, for example, big partners like supermarkets that have several units in our portfolio, to work together on energy reduction, but also getting the data right. But that's why we have the green lease. It's an agreement that we have with all our tenants, or now 60% of our tenants, to exchange data, but also to make better choices on sustainability. Yeah. But I think that's the biggest challenge, and I think that's in the whole market of real estate, to get the scope 3 emissions right and reduce emissions.
Maybe one follow-up. So what if you don't know the energy consumption for your leased assets, right? So like you own Stedenburg and Wereldhave, you know 60%, 40% you don't know, or not sure what the numbers are, but of the stuff you don't know, is there like an estimate in the scope 3 then, or you just have a number, and so like this number reflects what you do know and it doesn't reflect what you don't know?
I think the things that we do know is increasing, but when we started with this assessment for scope 1, 2, and 3, it's mainly modeled. So we use different estimates, but the data that we are getting is increasing, and I think it will be one of the biggest projects that we'll be working on getting the data right for scope 3 emissions.
Okay. So like in time that 30.456, right? That's like that will be more like a number that is based on what you do know, right? So like at the moment it's like part what you, right? Based on numbers and part based on estimates.
Yeah, true. Yeah, we do have a lot of data on aggregated level. So for example, in the Netherlands, it's quite easy to get data from Alliander, which is a net provider, to get it on an aggregated level. But to go to a tenant and try to have a conversation about energy reductions, you need to also know what's their current energy use. So that's what we need to get. Yeah. All right.
So in fact, you're producing the electricity with the solar panels. How do you do the bridge to the tenants, because you cannot sell probably? Legislation does not permit you to sell to them. How do you do? So for the larger roofs, you said, okay, you rent out to the supermarkets, but what do you do for the smaller tenants or the other tenants?
Yeah, that's a discussion that we have per center. So it could also be that we rent it out to several of the tenants, but we need to match the profile, of course. And yeah, I think it's a center. It's a different discussion per center, but we need to take all the tenants into account. Yeah.